Well, what happened, see, I told you we couldn't get into the ARP and what have you. And then Anthony Eden made his famous speech and called for the formation of the LDV, Local Defence Volunteers. And it overwhelmed everybody. And the first thing I saw was in 24 hours after the formation of the Home Guard, there was a man walking along the Mumbles Road by the bowling green with a steel helmet and an armband and a rifle. And that was his uniform, LDV, already. And the situation was so acute that they expected any minute for airborne troops we thought were going to land. They were across the water. Dunkirk was over. The Battle of Britain was still being fought, really. But Dunkirk was over, and now Hitler, after the speed with which he came through Holland and Belgium and France, was unbelievable. This was the origin of the word blitz, the blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It come through. And we, of course, people who had knowledge would realize, of course, you've got to build up a tremendous force before they could come across barges and God knows what, because an airborne invasion is always a disaster. It's only a forerunner. Every airborne invasion of the war was a complete disaster, starting with Crete. And there was no way they could invade this kind of, but everybody thought now the sky's going to be black with paratroopers, and they're all going to be dressed as nuns. Everybody going to be disguised as nuns. You see, we're going to have it's going to be like The Sound of Music, nuns everywhere. And immediately, right, even the priests were walking around with steel helmets with police on and carrying rifles. And God knows where they got them all from, but they did get enough rifles to go around. And then the Mumbles Home Guard, the first thing that happened was Major Davis was called upon as being an ex-field ranking officer to form them. And he got in touch with Bert Palmer, who was an estate agent, and these were all ex-warriors from World War One. And I remember Bert Palmer saying years later, a meeting was called inviting everybody from Mumbles to come to the Underhill Park. And he said, I had vague memories in my mind of how you form fours, because that was abandoned in the 30s when they marched in threes, columns of three. But he was trying to remember how to march people in fours. And they all came up there. And a lot of jobs fell automatically to the right people. The postman was a Mr. Mitchell, a cadaverous-looking gentleman who'd been a regular soldier all his life, come out, settled in Mumbles, and he automatically became the company sergeant major, and he was a very good one too, very professional, World War One. And then all the officers turned up from Langland and Caswell, where else? And the rank and file turned up from the village, where else, you see? And ranks were given out all over the place. And then after a week or two, we found that people who had their own businesses, like the butchers, Sergeant Rees, who was in Clem Thomas, took his shop over in Newton Road. George Rees, the butcher. Next to him, Walter O'Neill, who had the Wilder shop, signal sergeant automatically. Across the road, Cliff Ross, the butcher. And anyway, they all came, and ranks were given out and formed into various companies. And so after a few weeks, my friend Peter Hooper, who was studying to be an accountant, articled accountant, he said, I'm going to join the Home Guard, the LDV. And he was just a little bit older than I was. And I said to my mother and father, I now was 15. And we got together, Peter Smith, who was still alive and living down in the chalets in Caswell, myself, Duncan Bishop, Hubert Davis, who went down on a Saturday afternoon. And there was a gentleman in the Tivoli Cinema, in the Regent Cinema, which is now the Arcade. And this was open, and we went in, and the first thing I remember was the sloping floor, and there was the old screen. And on the right were a little group of men around a machine gun, which I didn't recognize what it was, but it turned out it was a Lewis gun. And in the other corner were a group of men around a Vickers gun. And we went up to the table there, and Captain Howard was sitting there, and he worked in the Guildhall. Now here, I recognised Pipsqueak and Wilfred from World War One, but the others I didn't recognise, and they were Boer War ribbons, you see. And there he was with his white hair, already now beginning to feel his rank. And he didn't have pips. He called himself Captain Howard from World War One, but he had two black bar across. And he's in denims. And he had a Sam Brown, which is a very rare combination, Sam Brown with denim, but he was there. And he put these forms down, and he said, can we join? And he said, if you're old enough, yes. And he said, you're 17? Oh, yes, 17. And we're all about 15, and we filled all these in. And we signed them. I remember one of our lot had great difficulty writing. It was rather sad, and he looked at him, you know, and to put him at ease, he said, have you been to bloody school, boy? You know, I don't remember that. But anyway, by the way, and that was it. And then we turned up then on the following Tuesday evening, and because we were from a certain part of Mumbles, we went into number 1 platoon, which was commanded by a chap called Chown, who lived on the top of Overland Road, Bircham. And he was a sniper in World War One, and in his house he had a telegram framed on the wall. He had a telegram sent to him by name that the war had finished, because he was a unit on his own, and he had this framed. Telegrams usually went to units at battalion level, but he had one sent to him, you know, to try to stop him shooting Germans after November the 11th, you see. And he had this platoon. And then Sergeant Bishop, who was a Passchendaele survivor of Passchendaele, and there were 4 sections and corporals, and my section was commanded by Corporal Jeffers, who was from the Coast Guards, known as Plum. He was rather large and a very nice chap, Plum, and his second in command was a Lance Corporal. So we had now, this didn't conform to an normal regular army proportions, as it were. Like, you used to find probably 3 sections to a platoon, and here we now had 4 or even 5, because in order to keep you living in an area, they'd have number 1 platoon would be perhaps about 40, 50 instead of 30, and that came from the heart of Oystermouth. Then you'd have the Norton boys and the South End boys in various ones, you see. And it sorted itself out, and all the World War One officers had regained their ranks, and then Major Davis was in command. Bert Palmer was second in command. The adjutant was Mr. Benjamin Walker-Jones, a solicitor. And I was seeing people I never knew existed, you know, as a village boy. You know, these people had come down from the hills, you know, down to take over. And all talked in a slightly different way to the these and thous of the village. But in my platoon, I remember people like George Turnbull. He was in the Hussars, and this man had served in the Boer War. He served in the Great War, and he was a signaller. And here he was again. After 2 wars, here he was again, and he knew the score. He knew what it was all about. He knew the score, that the situation was that a colossal army, probably one of the most efficient armies in the history of warfare, was assembling on the other side of the Bristol Channel, of the English Channel, and that one day they were going to come across very soon. And he knew that there wasn't a hope in hell of this body of men doing anything other than being able maybe to check them long enough for the regular forces to get it. And they all knew. We didn't. It was a lark. The whole thing was a lark. We were wet behind the ears. We were stupid youngsters, and we were going along there, something to do, and we wanted to be involved. But they knew, and yet they went again, and all of them, old men, 60s, 70s, and I suspect 80s as well, fully aware what was going on, and they went there. And there was a counterpart for every one of these men in Dad's army that you saw. This was a wonderful research program, and yet there was an intensity about it for that short period of time, up to about the spring of 41. This particular group of Home Guard they were very intense about it, and there was very serious undertones to it, no question of it, and especially for those lads who were involved along the south coast. And anyway, it took a fair while to get the organisation, and we were in just when they changed the LDV bands to Home Guard. We still had denims. They weren't enough to go around, but we got a top, and then we got the boots, and then greatcoats came in. And the thing that impressed me most was that the rifles we had in the Mumbles Home Guard were different to the rest of the country. They were all given Ross, Canadian Ross rifles from the Boer War period, which were 300, and we had Lee Enfield's 303. And this lent itself to our prestige, and when we entered drill competitions, we won them all. For two reasons. One, we had Lee Enfield rifles. One, we were the best. And thirdly, we had recruited a sergeant called Jack Anderson. And he and his brothers lived in Marine Villa. And Jack Anderson had a brother Mike, who was a policeman, and Ralph, who'd been wounded at Dunkirk, had a very bad scar on his face. He was a Coldstream Guardsman. Jack had been a Welsh Guardsman, and he'd been a company sergeant major in a Welsh Guardsman. Now he'd come into the Mumbles Home Guard, and he became the drill sergeant. And he took this small squad into all the competitions. And of course, I was a member of that squad. And there's one surviving member in Mumbles now, Tommy Lewis, who used to stand about 3 inches taller than I did. And now he's 3 inches shorter. And Tommy was called up for the Welsh Guards himself, and he served, I think it was in France, I'm not sure. But he's still around Mumbles now, delightful chap, Tommy. The obvious thing to do was to put them into positions where they could release the regular forces. And this is where the younger element in the Home Guard came more into their own. And I found that what it gave me, the Home Guard, was apart from this breakdown in the social barriers in Mumbles. I was now talking to people who'd never deigned to see me, you know, but you'd find yourself on guard at night in Blackpill, and there'd be a number of the Langland crowd, and this was a time in Mumbles when there was a closest integration, and we all got on very, very well. But the greatest contribution to me was what I learned from the old school. I learned drill to guard standard from Jack Anderson. I learned how to bone my boots so that they were like glass. I had a uniform now tailored to fit, to try to look the part. And I learned, I was sent on a course to Liverpool for a fortnight to the Altcar Rifle Ranges, regular army school, and he went in with the regular soldiers in a fortnight course on small arms, and Western Command Weapon Training School at Altcar. And it was a wonderful course, and I learned we didn't have Bren guns, we had Lewis guns. I learned the Lewis gun, I learned all about the latest grenades, I learned to put Tommy gun, and I learned the Sten gun, and all these we learned. I came back, I made up to corporal, and I was beginning to think I really was beginning to know it all. If you look at Blackpill Station, you've still got the camouflage on it. You've seen it, still painted there, the camouflage of Blackpill. And in front of it, there was a minefield, which everybody said were dummy mines. And then one day, in the middle of the day, there was a hell of an explosion all across Swansea. And when we came back in the Mumbles train, there was this great big crater, and a dog had got through the wire and gone in onto the field and got blown to smithereens. And it made everybody realise you don't go the other side. But we used to go, the church hall at Blackpill. Now that was, and at the back was where we kept all the ammunition and blacker bombars and weapons we kept there. And then behind that was the club in capitals, the club. That was the church club, a social club. And we used to go on guard at Blackpill at 9 o'clock every night. A picket would go up, and it'd come up about once every 3 weeks. Now, this was difficult for me because I was in school, I was in grammar school, you see, and there was no getting out of it. You had to do your turn. So we got up at 9 o'clock. And they were very good, the picket, because the sergeant would say, right, oh, as you're a lad, you go on first at 9 o'clock now, and two of you go on together. And I used to go on with Alec Cosman and do 2 hours together. So we go on at 9 and come back in at 11. Now, that meant the whole picket could go down to the woodman. And they'd all disappear. A whole bloody lot of them go down to the woodman, 9 o'clock, and come back at 10 o'clock when it closed. And Alec and I would have 1 more hour, and then we'd come in, you see. And anyway, then we go to bed because you get a night's sleep. And then 6 o'clock in the morning, we knocked off and we catch the Mumbles. The first train back at Blackpill, come home, wash, change, breakfast, and go to school. But it wasn't too bad, you know. And we learned what it was like to do a picket, etc., etc. And there were never any incidents. Now, prior to the guard room being there, it used to be at the bottom of the mails. Now, there was a row of houses which extended from Lloyd's garage to the bottom of the mails, a little row of houses which had now been knocked down. Now, the end one was taken over, and upstairs the area wardens, and downstairs the Home Guard had their gear there. And they used to do a patrol on the shore in case ordnance were being dropped, you know, something. And anyway, they'd come back in, and they had to do this patrol. All sentry duty on the front there was with rifles fully loaded, but not one up the spout, of course. And they'd come back in, and there's a drill you go through, you're probably familiar with it, where you clear your throat, you see, and then pull the trigger. And of course, this particular night, Mr. Thatcher was on, Lieutenant Thatcher, and he was in charge of the labour exchange, on a World War I officer. And he was there, and he gave the command clear. And of course, some clown that didn't do it enough time and pulled the trigger, and a bullet went up through the ceiling, you know, and it upset the wardens rather. They were very cross about it. I don't think anybody was hurt, but it gave them rather a shock when this round from a Lee Enfield rifle suddenly came through the floor. And they wanted it to be stopped forthwith. And we were moved then, and then we went down to the top. And then prior to that, one night, there was a stick of bombs were dropped across the bay. There was a wreck in the bay, being towed in, mine ship. There were several of them in the bay, and one was there. And rumours were that somebody thought it was the Ark Royal or something, all sorts of reasons. I don't know how the hell they found it out. And this aircraft had come in and dropped a stick of bomb. And this wretched fellow was on sentry duty in the first guard room at the bottom of the mails, and he was standing there ready to lay down his life for his country. And then suddenly he heard this whistling noise, and he realised what it was. And I mean, if you've ever been under a bomb, you really do think it's coming to you. You really do. And this thing was coming over, and of course he took off. He did what any wise man would do, and he took off. And he ran so fast, he hit one of the pumps on the Lloyd's petrol station. He hit it and broke his shoulder. And the impetus was such that he was after him before he fell to the ground, you know. They called us out one night. We only ever called out, I think, 3 times. And once was when the bells rang. Once when the bells didn't ring. And there was a scare, or there was going to be a landing or something. And then this particular night, we had a call-out system, which was very effective, you know, with a backup. One man had to call somebody else. But if he didn't turn up, there was a backup call to make sure that somebody else came. And we were called out this particular night. We went down to Regent Cinema, and what's going on? And Captain Hayes was there, whose wife ran the wool shop in Newton Road. He was there, and he said, they're having a bit of trouble up the Mumbles Hill. Something or other's going on. We don't know what it is, whether it's been a spontaneous fire amongst themselves, but they want all the help they can get. And so, any volunteers? Oh, yeah, who goes? And I remember who came with me, Peter Hooper and Frank Martin. So you 3 go off now, and another 3 will follow. And so we ran off. You don't need any gear, check your helmets and great coats, And off we went. It was about 10ish, something like that. And when we reached Oystermouth Station, we could see the glow. And so we started running along the line now. And then we just, before we came to the old lifeboat house, we saw these incendiary bombs all along the railway line. And of course we started picking these up because these were great souvenirs. And some of them would compete with the fig, often lost the fins. And we stuffed these in, and I had about three or four. And Frank picked up some, and so did Peter. Then we went up the steps, and now as we were coming up now, we could hear it now, and we could see the sparks flying up. And we ran around, and that's when all the vehicles were building up now, and there's a lot of activity. The AFS, what was the Auxiliary Fire Service, which became the NFS, they were there. And anyway, we came out, and then we were told to report to someone, and there was an NCO. They'd given out, he had a big diesel drum full of water, giving us these sacks. And we ran up. But there was no risk involved or anything at all. It was just exciting. We were beating and beating and beating. And we were grinding. And unfortunately, there was a breeze. And if you left the sparks behind, they'd come up again, you see. And in my mind and imagination, I was explaining this to my friends the next day, we were surrounded by a sea of flame in front and behind, which wasn't so, of course, you see, but you've got to lay it on a bit, haven't you, you know? And we were beating out these flames, and this was the first time I'd been involved. It was a real team effort, you know, and there were hundreds of soldiers all beating them up all the way up, you know. And the worry was an obvious one, because here was right on the side of the Mumbles Hill, facing out down, there was a beacon burning, and a wonderful, wonderful navigation laid. I think possibly in retrospect that they knew where they were without any aids like that. It's very rarely that these airmen got lost, but there was this thing. And of course, they're probably fully aware about the batteries and the position and relative to it, and they could have pinpointed it, you know. But we told the people of Mumbles that without any doubt at all that we'd saved their lives, you know, that Frank Martin. And you know about the sequel to it, the sequel to this was we came home, and as we were walking down through the village now, it was about 2 in the morning, we were a little bit weird, beginning to catch up on us now. And as we passed the pilot, the blackout curtain parted, and Reggie Hunt stuck his head up, the brother of Alec who was killed. And he said, "Everything all right now?" And I said, "Oh yes, Reg, touch and go, Reg, touch and go." You know? And I said, and he said, "Come in, boys." And we went, and the place was packed. It was about 2 in the morning, they're all there with their pints, you see. And we took our helmet off, and there was when I looked at Frank, he was black, you see, in the white mark, and I didn't realise, you know, how black it was. And all down the front of my coat was thermite from one of the bombs, or fine grey dust of magnesium powder. And I realised now, of course, that would have gone like that, you see. Not necessarily dangerous, because you shrug off the coat quickly. But that's when I lost one of the bombs. One of them I handed over as a souvenir when I saw them sticking out of my pocket. And then went home, a bed, and then following day now I started scraping. These fins were aluminium covered with what is a lovely Luftwaffe green. It's an odd shade of grey-green. And their aircraft camouflage was similar. And I scraped all this off to get down to the aluminium, polished it up, stuck it on, and I put a little label. This bomb was picked up by Private Grafton Maggs of the Mumbles Home Guard on the date. And I put it up on the mantel as a fixture, old-fashioned mahogany fixture with a mirror, and I put it on the top there, you see, above the coal fire. And there it was, you see. And I showed it to my father, and he said, "Well done, well done." And I put didn't know about the other one, I put the other one in the back of the drawn sideboard. And following afternoon, there's a shout from down the stairs, "Graf, come down here, get yourself down here." So I went downstairs. And there was Sergeant Martin, the policeman, and Frank, his son, had been with me. He said, "Have you got an incendiary bomb upstairs?" I said, yes. He said, bring it down here now at once. I put it down, and he unscrewed it, and the spring jumped out, and a spiral of aluminium, and he said, look, Glyn, see that copper cap there with a cross on it? That's a detonator. And Frank, his son, leaned over and he said, if you put a screwdriver on that, it goes round. And Frank, he said, what can you bloody do with them, Glyn? What can you do? My father, he said. And my father, I said, wait, what did you say? He said, it's live bomb. I said, you've got a live bomb upstairs on the mantelpiece above the fire. And he said, and Sergeant Martin said, he said, you're a bloody idiot, aren't you? And I said, yes. And he said, don't you ever do anything like that again. My father was speechless, you see, and he took the bomb away. I had it back the next day. He'd defused it, emptied all the thermite out, and given it back. And my father, he was puce. I've never seen, he was in a hell of a sweat. And he played hell with me. And, he said, I said, you're having a decent education and you a bit of common sense, he said, but he said, I've brought a bloody lunatic in the world, And what he never found out about the other one, I had that in the drawer, and that went to America. I told you about that with Joe Hunt, I get no relation to Alec, the one who had the captain, and he took it across to America, and it was auctioned in he had it defused, and it was auctioned in a Red Cross thing for British Red Cross, sold for $1,000 or so, and money for the fund, But no, I think really that I had a number of things going for me, and all those like me, there's nothing unusual at all in that the Home Guard gave me and all the others who were in it, the youngsters, a working knowledge of the army. We knew enough of ranks, we knew enough of weapons, and this is what we were very thankful for. We were keen, we were enthusiastic.